Welcome back, my dear people. Welcome to another story here on the channel. Tonight, we're going to take a break from the outside world. Lay down, close your eyes, and let's go back to a time when time passed more slowly. While you're getting comfortable, please comment below where you're watching and what time it is there. It's always magical to see people from so many corners of the world listening together, each one with their own pillow, their own routine, their own silence, but connected by the same story. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. That's what keeps these night trips happening every week. Imagine you're lying by a campfire, listening to someone tell an old story, one that was almost lost in time. Today, we're going back to a curious moment in history, the lost civilization of Atlantis. But this isn't a treasure hunt or an adventure story. Instead, we'll walk slowly through what daily life might have been like in this fabled place, examining the very real challenges that would have faced anyone trying to survive in such a world. Imagine yourself settling into the rhythm of an ancient coastal civilization, where the salt air carries both promise and peril. Picture marble streets that gleam in the Mediterranean sun, yet tremble beneath your feet when the earth decides to remind you of its power. Tonight, we'll explore not just the grand myth of Atlantis, but the human stories that might have unfolded in its shadow. The merchants who worried about their ships, the farmers who watched the sky for signs, the craftsmen who worked with trembling hands as distant rumblings echoed across the water that we single quotes LL begin with the daily struggles of ordinary Atlanteans, then journey through the volcanic catastrophe that may have inspired Plato's tale, explore the philosopher's true intentions, and finally peer into the lives of those who held power in this doomed paradise. Each step of our journey will remind us why survival in the ancient world required not just strength, but an intimate understanding of forces far beyond human control. Asterisk, the day begins, as it always does in Atlantis, with uncertainty written in the very stones beneath your feet. You wake not to the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor, but to a subtle vibration that runs through the marble foundations of your home. A reminder that this paradise exists at the mercy of forces far greater than human ambition. The morning light filters through your window, casting long shadows across walls built from the finest white stone, quarried from the very mountain that looms over your city like a sleeping giant. Imagine yourself as an ordinary citizen of this legendary place, perhaps a potter whose workshop sits near the harbor district. Your day begins before dawn, not by choice, but because the rhythm of the tides and the mountain's moods dictate when work can safely be done. The ground beneath Atlantis shifts constantly, sometimes so gently you barely notice, other times with enough force to crack the most carefully laid foundations. You've learned to read these movements like others read the weather, a skill essential for survival in a city built between the restless sea and an even more restless earth. Your morning routine includes checking the water level in the carefully constructed cisterns that dot your neighborhood. These aren't merely conveniences, but lifelines in a place where the underground springs can turn brackish without warning, tainted by the sea's intrusion or the mountain's sulfurous breath. The taste of your morning water tells you stories. Sweet and clear means the mountain sleeps peacefully. Slightly bitter warns of distant stirrings deep below. You've become expert at reading these subtle signs, as have all who would survive long in this precarious paradise. Walking through the streets toward the harbor, you pass buildings that showcase both the magnificence and the vulnerability of Atlantean engineering. The marble blocks fit together with precision that would impress modern architects. Yet many bear the telltale stress marks of a city in constant, subtle motion. Hairline cracks snake through even the newest construction, not from poor craftsmanship, but from the simple reality of building upon unstable ground. The Atlanteans have learned to work with this instability rather than against it, creating structures that flex and sway rather than break. But even the most ingenious engineering cannot completely overcome the fundamental challenge of there. Location. Asterisk, the harbor presents its own daily mysteries and dangers. Ships arrive each morning carrying goods from distant lands. Egyptian grain, Phoenician purple dye, Celtic bronze, but their captains always wear expressions of barely concealed relief. The approaches to Atlantis require navigating treacherous. Currents that shift without warning, created by underwater vents that can suddenly open or close. More than one merchant vessel has found itself caught in waters that turn from calm to violently turbulent in moments, pulled down by currents that seem to reach from the depths themselves. You watch the dock workers unload these precious cargoes, with practiced efficiency, but also with constant vigilance. The wooden piers, despite being rebuilt regularly with the finest materials, show signs of strain that go beyond normal wear. The supporting pillars sink deeper into the harbor floor each year, as if the earth beneath the water slowly pulls everything downward. Harbor engineers work continuously to maintain the docks, driving new pillars deeper and deeper, chasing solid ground that seems always to retreat before their efforts. The morning fish market reveals another layer of daily uncertainty. In Atlantean life, the fishermen's faces tell stories of nights spent on waters that behave unlike any others in the known world. They speak in hushed tones of areas where their nets come up warm, heated by springs that bubble up from unknowable depths. They describe nights when the sea itself seems to glow with an inner light, phosphorescent displays that are beautiful but unsettling, hinting at forces moving far below the surface. These phenomena affect the fish populations in unpredictable ways. Some mornings, the nets overflow with varieties found nowhere else in the Mediterranean. Other days, they return nearly empty from waters that had been productive for generations. Your work as a potter brings its own challenges unique to this unstable paradise. The clay deposits that make Atlantean pottery famous throughout the known world are found in areas where the ground steams with heat from below. Mining this precious clay requires workers to descend into caverns, where the air shimmers with warmth and the walls sometimes weep with moisture that tastes of minerals unknown to other lands. The clay itself possesses qualities that potters elsewhere cannot replicate. It fires to colors and hardness that make Atlantean ceramics treasured from Egypt to Britain. Yet working with this clay means constant exposure to vapors that make some workers ill over time, and mining it requires venturing into spaces where the ground can shift without warning. Your pottery wheel sits in a workshop designed with survival in mind. The walls are thick but flexible, the roof low and heavily supported. You've learned to work with the subtle tremors rather than despite them, using the earth's movement to help center clay on the wheel. This technique, passed down through generations of Atlantean craftsmen, creates pottery with a distinctive character, vessels that seem to capture something of the land's restless energy in their very form. Foreign buyers prize these pieces not just for their beauty, but for their uncanny ability to remain intact during sea voyages that crack pottery from other regions dot as the sun climbs higher. The day unfolds not with certainty, but with tension coiled just beneath the surface of routine. You return to your workshop after visiting the market, arms laden with goods, but eyes scanning the sky. The birds that nest in the cliffs above the harbor sometimes vanish for hours before a tremor, a silence that speaks louder than thunder. Today, they flutter nervously along the rooftops. Not a good sign. Asterisk inside, you prepare a new batch of clay. The mixture feels different, grainier, almost metallic. You wonder if the mountain has shifted again, altering the springs that feed your clay pits. There's no time to investigate. Orders must be filled before the next merchant ship departs. You work swiftly, rhythm in your hands, but part of your mind stays attuned to the floor's subtle pulse. Is that vibration a passing breeze, or the first hint of something deeper? Outside, the city hums with the tension of those who know how thin the crust is between them and disaster. Children play in alleys, but even their laughter sounds careful. Priests perform quiet rites at the edge of public squares, not for show, but out of real fear that the gods who raised Atlantis from the sea may one day drag it back. By late afternoon, the scent of sulfur rides the wind. Not strong, but present. Enough to make you pause at the kiln before lighting it. You've learned that the mountain sometimes exhales before it speaks, and when it speaks, it doesn't whisper. Still, the wheel turns. The clay yields. The fire takes form. And in this fragile rhythm, Atlantean life endures, not in defiance of the Earth's power, but in dance with it. Asterisk, as the sun reaches its zenith, Atlantis reveals more of its dual nature, breathtaking beauty coupled with ever-present danger. The afternoon heat builds not just from the Mediterranean sun, but from the warm breath of the earth itself. You notice this most clearly in the Agra, where the marble plaza retains heat long after other cities would begin to cool. The stones beneath your feet radiate warmth that penetrates even the thickest sandals, a constant reminder that your city sits atop forces that could awaken at any moment. The afternoon brings different challenges for different members of Atlantean society. Farmers working the terraced slopes that ring the city face. The peculiar problem of soil that sometimes grows too warm for certain crops. They've developed specialized techniques, rotating their plantings based not just on seasons, but on the varying heat patterns that emerge from different areas of their land. Some terraces produce extraordinary yields of crops that grow nowhere else, nourished by mineral-rich soil heated from below. Others must be left fallow when the earth grows too restless, the soil too hot for seeds to survive. You observe these agricultural challenges during your afternoon. Journey to deliver pottery to customers in the upper districts. The path winds through neighborhoods where the wealthy have built their homes on terraces, carved directly into the mountainside. These houses enjoy spectacular views of the harbor and surrounding islands, but their inhabitants live with daily reminders of their precarious position. Garden walls frequently require repair from settling and shifting ground. Elaborate fountain systems, fed by the mountain's natural springs, sometimes run dry without warning when underground channels shift or become blocked by seismic activity. Wealthy District showcases the heights of Atlantean engineering and artistry, but also reveals the constant battle against natural forces. Houses feature ingenious ventilation systems designed to channel away the sulfurous gases that occasionally seep from the ground. Windows are positioned to catch cooling sea breezes, while avoiding exposure to the hot winds that sometimes descend from the mountain's upper slopes. Gardens are planted with species selected not just for beauty, but for their tolerance of unusual soil conditions and their ability to thrive in the mineral-rich but sometimes unstable earth. Your pottery deliveries take you to homes where the floors are made of marble slabs fitted with a precision that allows them to shift without cracking. A necessity in a city where the ground moves regularly. The homeowners have learned to arrange their furniture with this movement in mind, securing valuable items in ways that protect them from the subtle but constant motion. You notice that even the wealthiest Atlanteans keep their most precious possessions in specially designed containers that can withstand the frequent tremors that shake their paradise. The afternoon also brings increased activity in the temples that dot the city's landscape. These aren't merely places of worship, but centers for monitoring the Earth's moods. The priests have developed elaborate systems for tracking the mountain's behavior, reading signs in everything from the color of spring water to the patterns of bird migration. Temple servants maintain detailed records of tremor patterns, volcanic emissions, and changes in the underwater springs that feed the harbor. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, helps the city's leaders make decisions about everything from shipping schedules to construction projects. In the Temple of Poseidon, the city's most magnificent structure, you witness the daily rituals. That attempt to appease the god of both sea and earthquakes. The temple itself demonstrates Atlantean engineering at its finest. Massive columns that can flex without breaking. Foundations that extend deep into the bedrock. Walls designed to distribute seismic forces rather than resist them. Yet even this masterpiece of construction bears the marks of its precarious location. Careful observers can spot the nearly invisible seams where sections have been rebuilt after particularly severe tremors, and the floor shows the subtle unevenness that comes from decades of settling and resettling. The priests perform their afternoon ceremonies with a solemnity that reflects their intimate knowledge of the forces they seek to appease. Their chants include specific prayers for stability of the earth, calm seas, and protection from the mountain's wrath. These aren't merely ritual words, but expressions of genuine concern based on generations of experience with natural disasters. The temple's archives contain records of previous catastrophes, floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions that have periodically devastated parts of the city, requiring massive reconstruction efforts. Your afternoon concludes with a visit to the harbor's lighthouse, a structure that serves not just as a navigation aid, but as an early warning system for the various dangers that threaten sea traffic around Atlantis. The lighthouse keepers maintain detailed logs of unusual phenomena, strange glows in the water, unexpected current changes, alterations in the behavior of seabirds and marine life. These observations help them advise incoming ships about potential hazards, but also serve as part of the city's overall monitoring system for natural disasters. From the lighthouse's height, you can see the full scope of Atlantean civilization in the afternoon light. The city spreads across its terraced landscape like a jewel set between sea and mountain, its white marble buildings gleaming in the sun. Ships dot the harbor, their sails filled with the steady winds that make this location so attractive for trade. The surrounding islands shimmer in the distance, some showing the green of fertile agriculture, others bearing the gray scars of past volcanic activity. It's a vista of incredible beauty and prosperity, yet one that carries an undertone of impermanence, a reminder that all this magnificence exists at the sufferance of forces beyond human control. Asterisk as evening approaches. The golden light softens the sharp angles of the city, but does little to cool the breath rising from the earth below. You pause on your walk back from the lighthouse, feeling the warmth still emanating from the stone walls. The sea breeze carries a faint metallic scent tonight, the kind that precedes subtle shifts underground. You note it, as always, without panic. Just awareness. Passing through the agora again, you notice the priests lighting censers at the temple steps, their smoke curling toward the sky in slow spirals. They're not for show. The incense masks the sulfur that sometimes seeps up in the cooler hours, a precaution as much as a prayer. Traders begin to shutter their stalls, not because of danger, but because dusk in Atlantis carries its own kind of gravity. A quiet respect for what lies beneath back in your neighborhood. Families eat their evening meals with doors open to catch the last light. Conversation is quiet, rhythmic, often interrupted by someone tilting their head slightly, listening, not to each other, but to the ground. A long silence might mean someone felt something you didn't. Your workshop is still warm from the afternoon sun. You inspect the day's creations. A few show minor warping, not from poor work, but from a subtle change in the kill's heat, likely caused by a pressure shift underground. It's small, manageable, but you mark it. As evening approaches, Atlantis takes on a different character entirely. The sunset casts long shadows across the marble streets, and the cooling air brings with it subtle sounds that daylight masks. The distant rumble of underground waters, the soft hiss of gases escaping from natural vents, the barely audible groaning of buildings adjusting to temperature changes, and the day's accumulated seismic stresses. This is when Atlanteans become most aware of their city's precarious nature, when the beauty of their surroundings cannot entirely mask the underlying tensions that define their existence. Your evening meal, shared with other craftsmen in a tavern, near the harbor, reflects both the abundance and uncertainty of Atlantean life. The wine flows freely, pressed from grapes grown in volcanic soil that gives it a distinctive mineral tang found nowhere else in the Mediterranean world. The bread bears the slight sulfur taste that comes from grain grown in fields warmed by underground heat. Fish dishes feature varieties that thrive only in the warm, mineral-rich waters surrounding the city, species that other cultures have never encountered, with flavors both exotic and slightly unsettling. Conversation around. The evening table inevitably turns to the day's signs and portents. Someone mentions that the sacred springs in the upper district ran slightly warmer today than usual. Another notes that the dolphins, usually plentiful in the harbor, seem to avoid certain areas where they normally play. An old fisherman speaks quietly about strange lights he observed beneath the water during his pre-dawn fishing expedition. These aren't casual observations, but vital intelligence shared among people who understand that their survival depends on reading the subtle language of their environment. The tavern keeper, a man whose family has operated this establishment for 5 generations, shares stories passed down through his lineage. He speaks of the great tremor of his grandfather's time, when half the harbor district had to be rebuilt and entire streets of houses slid down the terraced slopes into the sea. He describes the year when the mountain's breath turned so hot that it withered crops throughout the region, forcing the city to rely entirely on imported food for an entire season. These stories serve not as entertainment, but as education, lessons about what this paradise has demanded from its inhabitants in the past, and might demand again not after your meal. You join the evening procession that winds through the city's main thoroughfares. This isn't a festival or celebration, but a daily ritual of watchfulness that has evolved over generations of living with constant uncertainty. Citizens walk slowly through different districts, observing, listening, noting any changes from the previous day. Children are taught from an early age to participate in this communal monitoring, learning to recognize the signs that might herald danger to their community. The procession moves through neighborhoods where the evening light reveals details invisible during the day's brightness. Stress fractures in building foundations become more apparent in the angled shadows. The warm glow emanating from certain street stones indicates areas where underground heat sources have shifted closer to the surface. Garden plants show subtle signs of distress that might indicate changes in soil chemistry or temperature. These observations are mentally cataloged by experienced citizens and shared with the city's officials, creating an informal but highly effective early warning system. Your path takes you through the artisan quarter, where workshops stand empty for the night but still radiate the heat of forges and kilns that must burn hotter than those in other cities. The mineral-rich clays and ores that make Atlantean crafts so prized require higher temperatures to work properly, and the craftsmen have learned to build their facilities to withstand not just their own heat, but the additional warmth that sometimes rises from the earth below. Even at night, you can feel the accumulated heat of the day's work, a reminder of the extra energy required to create beauty in this challenging environment. The residential districts reveal another aspect of evening life in Atlantis, the constant maintenance required to keep homes safe and habitable. Householders emerge to check foundation stones, ensuring that the day's minor tremors haven't created new cracks or weaknesses. They inspect cisterns and wells, monitoring water levels and quality for signs of underground changes. Garden walls are examined for settling, and loose stones are reset before they can become hazards. This isn't paranoia, but practical wisdom accumulated over generations of living in an unstable paradise. Near the harbor, the evening shift of workers begins their vigil. These are the men and women who monitor the city's defenses against the sea, maintaining the breakwaters that protect the harbor from sudden swells, checking the drainage systems that prevent flooding during storms, and watching for changes in tide patterns that might indicate underwater seismic activity. Their work continues through the night, because the sea around Atlantis never truly sleeps, and the forces beneath it remain active regardless of human schedules. The lighthouse begins its nightly beacon as you complete your evening circuit of the city. Its light serves multiple purposes, guiding ships safely to harbor, warning them away from newly dangerous areas, and providing a central point of reference for the city's own inhabitants during times of crisis. The lighthouse keepers work in shifts that never end, maintaining not just the beacon, but the complex system of signals that communicate with watchtowers on nearby islands and coastal settlements. This network provides early warning of approaching storms, unusual sea conditions, and other phenomena that could threaten the city dot as full darkness settles over Atlantis. You return to your home with mixed feelings of pride and apprehension. The city's beauty at night is undeniable. Marble buildings gleaming in the moonlight, harbor waters reflecting the stars, the warm glow from underground sources creating an almost magical atmosphere. Yet this beauty comes with a price that its inhabitants pay daily in vigilance, preparation, and the constant knowledge that their paradise could change irrevocably without warning. Sleep comes slowly in Atlantis, not just because of the warm, mineral-scented air, but because of the subtle sounds and sensations that remind residents, even in their dreams, that they live at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. In the quiet hours after nightfall, Atlantis enters its most intimate state, a city half asleep, but never truly resting. Lamps flicker softly behind intricately carved stone screens, casting patterns of light across courtyards and tiled floors. In wealthier homes, soft music drifts from stringed instruments played in enclosed patios, meant not for performance, but for reassurance, a melody to soothe nerves frayed by another day of uncertainty. In simpler quarters, the lullabies are different. The soft clinking of wind chimes tuned to seismic sensitivity, designed to tinkle with the faintest tremor, and the occasional groan of timber settling unevenly on ever-shifting ground. Asterisk, you lie in your small sleeping chamber, the walls, thick but permeable, allowing the warmth of the mountain to radiate inward. It's a comfort and a warning. Your ancestors chose to build here, knowing the earth could embrace or betray at any time. Above your bed hangs a polished bronze disc, an old tradition, said to ring before large tremors, more reliable than any priest. Tonight, it remains silent, but your ears remain half-tuned to it, nonetheless. Outside, patrols make their rounds through the streets, not in armor or with weapons, but with instruments, pressure gauges, humidity sensors, thermometers, designed by Atlantean artisans to detect the mountain's shifting moods. These watchers make no noise beyond the soft clink of their tools, and in some districts, people offer quiet greetings as they pass, exchanging brief, coded observations. The stone near the east fountain is warmer today. The water at the artisan baths smells faintly metallic. These are the city's real defenses. Awareness, vigilance, shared wisdom. At the western edge of the city, a cluster of observatories keeps silent watch on the stars and the sea. To outsiders, these towers seem places of astronomy, and they are. But the scholars who work there also track patterns of wave height, animal migrations, changes in ocean phosphorescence. Their maps are littered with notations incomprehensible to those not trained in the subtle language of Atlantean science. Red circles marking quiet zones, blue arrows showing thermal flows, gold ink recording days when the moon seemed to pull harder on the tides. They are the night's librarians of danger. Meanwhile, deeper underground, where few venture after sunset, temple apprentices maintain the sacred mechanisms bronze and obsidian machines, calibrated generations ago to detect the smallest shifts in subterranean pressure. These mechanisms hum and tick in darkened chambers, their outputs etched into long scrolls by scribes with steady hands. The rituals here are not for gods, but for data. Chants that keep the rhythm steady, silence that allows subtle echoes to be heard, incense chosen to react visibly with invisible gases dot in the harbor. The sounds are muted. The day's bustle has faded into the soft creak of moored ships and the gentle slap of water against hulls. But even here, the city listens. Glass spheres float just beneath the surface, tethered by woven copper cables, early seismographs. Of a sort, crafted to detect sudden pressure changes beneath the waves. The lighthouse's beacon still sweeps across the sea, and in rhythm with it, signal fires are lit on nearby islets, their glow mirrored in coated reflections on polished metal shields. Not far from the docks, in a cluster of aging tenements built from heat-baked stone, older citizens sit outside their doors, sharing hushed stories beneath the stars. These elders remember things the young only study: the taste of ash in the air from a decade ago, the way the ground once cracked open in the temple square, the year the fish all vanished for a fortnight. Their memories are the oral archive of Atlantis, and their stories hold weight. When an old woman says, "The air feels like it did the night before the hot rains," people listen. You make one last round before retiring fully. The cistern behind your home is steady. The stones of your threshold show no new cracks. The air smells mineral-rich, but not sulfurous. A good sign. And yet, your fingers linger on the wooden beam above your doorway, feeling for vibrations too faint for ears. You know what others do. That silence can be as ominous as sound. Inside again, you write in your personal log, a habit passed down from your grandfather. Every evening, a few lines. The temperature, the taste of the well water, the way the ground felt underfoot. Generations of these journals are stored in a sealed niche below your floor. A personal history of the land's moods. Tonight, you add a single line. No tremors, but the birds flew inland at sunset. Finally, you lie down again. The city hushed around you, but never still. In the distance, a muffled thud. Not an earthquake, just a stone shifting under its own. Wait. Still, your heart pauses. Every sound here carries history, and every night is a quiet negotiation between beauty and risk. Sleep comes slowly and lightly. Your dreams, like those of all Atlanteans, are filled with strange landscapes. Glowing oceans, cracked earth, columns bending in the wind, voices rising from volcanic vents. You've learned not to fear them. They're not omens, they're memory, warnings, lessons etched into your blood. Asterisk, the morning dawns clear and deceptively peaceful over the island of Thera, though those with experience reading the signs might notice that the seabirds circle higher than usual, and the dolphins that typically play in the harbor have moved to deeper waters. This is the Bronze Age, approximately 1600 years before the birth of Christ, and the Minoan civilization reaches its peak of prosperity and influence across the Aegean Sea. Thera serves as one of their most important outposts, a thriving center of trade and culture, built upon what the inhabitants don't yet understand is one of the most dangerous volcanic systems in the Mediterranean world. Imagine yourself as a merchant arriving at Thera's bustling port after a journey. From Crete, your ship, laden with precious goods destined for markets throughout the Aegean, navigates carefully through waters that shimmer with an unusual clarity. The water here possesses a distinctive blue-green tint, caused by minerals leaching from underwater vents that the locals have learned to recognize as normal, even beneficial. They believe these warm springs bring prosperity to their fishing grounds, attracting species of fish found nowhere else in their region. The truth, That these springs indicate massive volcanic activity beneath the seafloor remains hidden in the depths, waiting to reveal itself with catastrophic force. The harbor town of Akrotiri spreads before you like a testament to Minoan engineering and artistic achievement. Multi-story buildings rise from carefully planned streets, their walls decorated with frescoes that celebrate the bounty of land and sea. The famous blue monkeys dance across painted walls, while dolphins leap through artistic waves that mirror the real creatures playing in the harbor beyond. These aren't mere decorations, but expressions of a culture that sees itself in perfect harmony with the natural world. A harmony that exists only because the true nature of their environment remains dormant, sleeping beneath their feet. Cargo includes items that showcase the extensive trade networks connecting Thera to distant lands. Egyptian gold worked into intricate jewelry, Lebanese cedar for construction projects, African ivory carved into decorative objects and spices. From lands so distant that their names exist only in whispered stories. The wealth flowing through Thera demonstrates the island's strategic importance, positioned perfectly to control sea routes between the established civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia and the emerging cultures of mainland Greece and Asia Minor. Walking through Akrotiri's streets, you encounter a society that has adapted brilliantly to its island environment while remaining completely unaware of the danger lurking beneath. The buildings feature sophisticated drainage systems designed to handle the occasional heavy rains that sweep across the Aegean, but these same drains will later serve as channels for the pyroclastic flows that will preserve the city for millennia. The multi-story construction demonstrates advanced engineering knowledge, with interior spaces designed to stay cool during summer heat. Yet these same buildings will become tombs when volcanic ash begins to fall. The marketplace bustles with activity that reflects both local prosperity and international connections. Farmers from the island's interior bring produce grown in soil that owes its incredible fertility to previous volcanic eruptions, a gift from the earth that they accept without understanding its true source. The grapes grown in Thera's volcanic soil produce wine with a distinctive flavor prized throughout the Mediterranean, while the island's grain yields surpass those of less geologically active regions. This abundance comes directly from the volcanic activity that will eventually destroy their civilization, creating a tragic irony that the very source of their prosperity contains the seeds of their doom. Local craftsmen work with materials that reflect their unique environment. Pottery incorporates volcanic ash that gives Theran ceramics their distinctive strength and color, while builders use volcanic stone that provides excellent insulation against both heat and cold. The island's obsidian deposits, created by previous eruptions, supply the raw material for tools and weapons that rival metal implements in sharpness and durability. Every aspect of their material culture bears the mark of volcanic activity, yet the inhabitants view these benefits as simple gifts from their gods rather than warnings of potential catastrophe. The religious practices of Thera reveal a society deeply connected to natural forces, though they misunderstand the true nature of what they worship. Temples dedicated to earth goddesses feature elaborate rituals designed to ensure continued fertility of the land and sea. Priests monitor natural phenomena, changes in spring water temperature, unusual animal behavior, shifts in wind patterns, but interpret these signs through religious rather than scientific frameworks. Their careful observations and detailed records of natural phenomena would be invaluable to modern volcanologists. Yet they lack the knowledge to understand what their meticulous documentation actually reveals about their precarious situation. The afternoon brings different activities that further demonstrate the complexity of Theran society and its relationship with the volatile environment. Administrative centers bustle, with officials managing the complex logistics of international trade, maintaining detailed records on clay tablets that document everything from cargo manifests to weather patterns. These archives represent centuries, of accumulated knowledge about Aegean sailing conditions, seasonal patterns, and the intricate web of relationships connecting islands throughout the region. Unknown to those who maintain them, these records will become some of humanity's most important evidence about Bronze Age civilization, preserved by the very disaster that destroys their creators. Asterisk. Residential districts reveal the daily lives of people who have created a sophisticated urban society on their volcanic island. Houses feature interior courtyards designed to provide cooling airflow during hot summer months, while winter heating. Combis from hypocaust systems that circulate warm air beneath floors. These heating systems work particularly well on Thera, because the ground temperature remains higher than on other islands, a phenomenon the inhabitants attribute to their sunny climate rather than underground volcanic heat. Kitchens feature advanced ventilation systems that channel smoke and cooking odors away from living spaces, technology that will prove insufficient against the toxic gases that will eventually fill their streets. Family life in Thera reflects both the prosperity their volcanic environment provides and the constant adaptation required to thrive in such conditions. Children learn to swim almost before they can walk, because the sea provides both livelihood and escape route during emergencies. Young people master trades that take advantage of local resources, working with obsidian, cultivating specialized crops, creating pottery from volcanic clay. Education includes extensive knowledge about weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the behavior of animals that might signal approaching storms or other natural events. This education system produces citizens remarkably well adapted to their environment, yet completely unprepared for the scale of catastrophe their island can produce. The evening brings social activities that celebrate the prosperity and cultural sophistication achieved by Theran society. Public gatherings feature music, dance, and storytelling that reflect their position at the crossroads of multiple civilizations. Art and architecture demonstrate influences from Egypt, Anatolia, and mainland Greece, synthesized into distinctively Minoan forms. Religious festivals honor deities associated with natural forces, featuring elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure continued divine favor for their island paradise. Asterisk. The first signs emerge not with the dramatic violence that will follow, but with subtle changes that experienced observers might notice if they know what to look for. The morning air carries a different quality, a slight metallic taste that wasn't present the day before, and an unusual stillness that makes even the most common sounds seem muffled and distant. The harbor water, normally alive with fish and dolphins, appears strangely empty, as if the sea creatures possess instincts that humans have long forgotten in their pursuit of civilization and prosperity. Deep beneath Thera, forces that have been building for centuries finally reach the critical point where rock can no longer contain the immense pressures generated by molten magma. The island sits atop a massive magma chamber that has been slowly filling and heating for generations, creating conditions comparable to a vast underground pressure cooker. When the system finally fails, it does so with a violence that surpasses human comprehension, releasing energy equivalent to hundreds of nuclear weapons in a matter of hours. The initial eruption begins not with fire shooting into the sky, but with the ground itself beginning to fracture and subside. Buildings that have stood for generations suddenly develop cracks that spread across their walls like spider webs, while the carefully laid stone streets begin to buckle and shift. The sophisticated drainage systems that have kept the city dry during countless storms now begin to emit strange sounds, gurgling, hissing noises that suggest something far more dangerous than water moving through their channels. Citizens who have lived their entire lives on Thera initially respond with a practiced calm of people accustomed to minor seismic events. They secure loose objects, check their water supplies, and wait for the trembling to pass, as it has so many times before. But this time, the shaking doesn't stop. Instead, it grows stronger, accompanied by sounds unlike anything in their experience. Deep, resonant booms that seem to come from the center of the earth, followed by a low rumbling that makes the air itself vibrate with barely contained power. The first pyroclastic flows begin as relatively small events, clouds of hot gas, and ash that pour from newly opened vents in the island's interior. These flows move faster than running humans, reaching temperatures that instantly ignite everything in their path. The inhabitants of outlying settlements have no time to escape, no warning beyond the few moments when they might glimpse the approaching gray cloud before it engulfs them completely. Those lucky enough to be in the main town of Akrotiri initially remain safe, protected by distance and the island's topography. But their reprieve is temporary as the eruption intensifies. The magma chamber beneath the island begins to empty, with catastrophic results. The ground that once supported thriving communities starts to collapse into the void left by expelled volcanic material. Entire districts of Akrotiri simply disappear as the earth beneath them gives way, swallowed by caverns that open without warning. The harbor, once busy with merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean, becomes a churning cauldron of superheated water as underwater vents release steam and ash directly into the sea. The ash fall begins gradually, almost gently, with fine particles drifting down like gray snow. Citizens might initially mistake it for a distant fire, or perhaps dust kicked up by the ongoing earthquakes. But the ash continues to fall, growing thicker and heavier with each passing hour. What begins? As a light dusting soon accumulates to ankle depth, then knee depth, then higher still. The weight of volcanic ash far exceeds that of snow, and roofs designed to handle winter weather begin to creak and sag under loads they were never meant to bear. Asterisk. Families attempt to shelter in their homes, closing shutters and sealing doors against the falling ash, but their sophisticated buildings become death traps as toxic gases seep through every crack and crevice. The ash itself carries poisonous compounds that burn lungs and eyes, while the associated gases include hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide that can kill in concentrated doses. Those who try to flee find themselves stumbling through a gray wasteland, where familiar landmarks have disappeared beneath the accumulating volcanic debris. The final phase of the eruption arrives with the collapse of the magma chamber roof, creating a caldera that instantly draws massive amounts of seawater into contact with molten rock. The resulting steam explosions dwarf everything that has come before, launching columns of ash and debris more than 20 miles into the atmosphere. These columns create their own weather systems, generating lightning storms within the volcanic cloud and distributing ash across hundreds of miles of the eastern Mediterranean. The tsunamis generated by the caldera collapse travel outward from Thera at speeds approaching that of modern jet aircraft. These aren't ordinary ocean waves, but walls of water carrying the debris of a destroyed civilization. Fragments of buildings, pieces of ships, and the shattered remains of what was once one of the Bronze Age's most prosperous communities. The waves sweep across the Aegean within hours, striking Crete with such force that Minoan coastal cities are obliterated completely, their populations given no warning and no opportunity to escape. For those experiencing the disaster on Thera itself, the final moments arrive with a terrifying combination of fire, water, and crushing debris. The pyroclastic flows that earlier devastated the island's interior now pour directly into the collapsed caldera, creating massive steam explosions that launch superheated rocks and ash in all directions. The sea rushes in to fill the new depression, turning instantly to steam and creating pressure waves that can be heard hundreds of miles away. The ash cloud generated by Thera's destruction spreads across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, creating atmospheric disturbances that affect weather patterns throughout the region. Crops fail across a wide area as sunlight is blocked by volcanic particles suspended in the atmosphere. The fine ash that travels the farthest contains glass-like particles that can cause severe respiratory problems, affecting populations who never even knew the island of Thera existed. Within hours, one of the Bronze Age's most advanced civilizations simply ceases to exist. The island that supported thousands of inhabitants, dozens of settlements, and extensive agricultural and trading networks becomes a flooded caldera surrounded by barren remnants of land. The sophisticated urban center of Akrotiri lies buried beneath dozens of feet of volcanic ash, its multi-story buildings, elaborate frescoes, and advanced infrastructure perfectly preserved, but utterly inaccessible to the civilization that created them. The destruction of Thera sends shock waves throughout the Bronze Age world that extend far beyond the immediate physical devastation. Within days of the eruption, the catastrophe begins to ripple outward through the interconnected networks of trade, politics, and culture that define Mediterranean civilization. What begins as a localized natural disaster evolves into a regional crisis that will reshape the balance of power across the ancient world, and perhaps inspire the most enduring myth in human history. The island of Crete, center of Minoan civilization, and Thera's closest major neighbor, bears the first and most devastating impact of the expanding catastrophe. The tsunamis generated by Thera's collapse arrive at Crete's northern shores with little warning, striking during the busy morning hours, when harbors are full of ships and coastal communities are engaged in their daily activities. The waves, carrying the debris of Thera's destruction, surge far inland, destroying not just coastal settlements, but also the elaborate harbor facilities that make Minoan sea power possible. Knossos, the great palace complex that serves as the administrative heart of Minoan civilization, sits inland and initially escapes the worst of the tsunami damage. However, the palace's sophisticated bureaucracy quickly realizes the magnitude of the disaster as reports arrive from devastated coastal communities. The Linear A tablets that record the palace's administrative activities during this period, though still undeciphered by modern scholars, likely document a civilization in crisis, struggling to maintain order as its economic foundation collapses. The Minoan fleet, once the dominant naval force in the Aegean, suffers catastrophic losses as ships anchored in harbors are swept inland by the tsunamis, while vessels at sea face mountainous waves generated by the underwater explosions. The skilled navigators and experienced crews that make Minoan trade networks possible are lost in numbers that cannot be quickly replaced. Those ships that survive find themselves sailing through waters contaminated with floating debris and volcanic ash, making navigation treacherous and trade routes temporarily impassable. Agricultural communities throughout the region face their own crisis as the volcanic ash cloud spreads across the eastern Mediterranean. The ashfall, while lighter at greater distances from Thera, still affects crop yields across a vast area. The particles suspended in the atmosphere reduce sunlight, reaching the ground, creating cooler temperatures and shorter growing seasons. Farmers accustomed to predictable Mediterranean weather patterns find themselves dealing with unprecedented conditions that their traditional knowledge cannot address. The disruption of normal weather patterns affects regions as distant as Egypt, where the annual Nile flood, essential for Egyptian agriculture, may be altered by the global climate effects of Thera's eruption. Some scholars suggest that Egyptian records from this period describe unusual flooding patterns and crop failures that could be connected to volcanic activity in the Aegean. If so, the destruction of Thera contributes to political instability. In Egypt, during a crucial period of the Second Intermediate Period, when the country struggles with internal divisions and foreign invasions, trade networks that have developed over centuries begin to collapse as key links in the chain disappear. Overnight, Thera's position as a crucial stopover point for ships traveling between Crete and the mainland makes its destruction particularly significant for Mediterranean commerce. Ships that once relied on Theran ports for supplies, repairs, and shelter, during storms must find alternative routes that may be longer, more dangerous, or simply impossible given the limited range of Bronze Age vessels. The psychological impact of Thera's destruction spreads even faster than its physical effects. News of an entire island's disappearance travels through oral networks that connect communities across the Mediterranean, carrying with it a sense of vulnerability that challenges fundamental assumptions about the stability of the world. Coastal communities that have existed for generations suddenly question their own safety, leading to population movements as people seek more secure locations inland. Religious and cultural responses to the disaster vary across different civilizations, but all reflect attempts to understand and cope with a catastrophe beyond human experience. Some cultures interpret the destruction as divine punishment for moral failures, leading to increased emphasis on religious observance and ritual purification. Others see it as evidence of cosmic warfare between competing deities, inspiring new mythologies that attempt to explain how such devastation could occur in a world they thought they understood. The technological knowledge preserved in knowledge. Thera's workshops and schools disappears with the island's destruction, creating gaps in craft, traditions that affect the broader Mediterranean world. Theran specialists in obsidian working, advanced pottery techniques, and sophisticated building methods take their knowledge to their graves, forcing other communities to redevelop these skills through trial and error. The loss of accumulated expertise represents a significant setback for Bronze Age technological development. Political consequences follow as smaller island communities, now aware of their vulnerability to natural disasters, seek protection from larger powers or form new alliances for mutual defense. The balance of power in the Aegean shifts as Minoan influence wanes due to their losses, creating opportunities for emerging powers like Mycenae and Greece to expand their own spheres of influence. These political changes will have lasting effects on the development of Greek civilization and the eventual rise of classical antiquity. Asterisk. The refugees who escaped from Crete and other affected areas carry with them memories of the catastrophe that will be passed down through generations of oral tradition. These stories, embellished and transformed over centuries of retelling, may eventually reach the ears of Egyptian priests, who will share them with a visiting Greek philosopher named Plato. The transformation of historical memory into mythological narrative begins immediately after the disaster, as survivors struggle to make sense of experiences that defy conventional understanding. Maritime technology begins to evolve in response to the demonstrated vulnerability of sea travel in the post-Thera world. Shipbuilders develop new techniques for creating more seaworthy vessels capable of longer voyages without depending on intermediate ports for shelter. Navigation methods improve as mariners learn to read wind and water conditions that might indicate unusual dangers. These technological advances, born from necessity, will eventually contribute to the age of exploration that characterizes later Mediterranean civilizations. The environmental effects of Thera's eruption continue to influence regional conditions for years after the initial catastrophe. Volcanic particles in the atmosphere gradually settle out, but their chemical composition affects soil chemistry across wide areas. Some regions experience improved fertility as volcanic ash provides mineral nutrients, while others suffer from increased acidity that makes agriculture more difficult. These long-term environmental changes contribute to population movements and cultural developments that reshape the Mediterranean world. In the twilight of classical Athens, as the shadows of evening settle across the Academy's garden paths, an aging philosopher sits composing what will become one of history's most enduring mysteries. Plato, already renowned throughout the Greek world for his philosophical dialogues, and his theories about ideal forms of government, begins crafting a story that he presents as ancient history, but which serves purposes far more complex than simple historical narrative. The tale of Atlantis emerges not as archaeological report or geographic description, but as a carefully constructed philosophical instrument designed to illuminate truths about human nature, political systems, and the inevitable fate of civilizations that lose sight of virtue. The Athens of Plato's time bears little resemblance to the confident, expansionist democracy that once dominated the Greek world. The Peloponnesian War has ended in devastating defeat. The city's walls have been torn down by Spartan victors, and the democratic government that once seemed the pinnacle of human political achievement has revealed itself capable of both brilliance and catastrophic error. The execution of Socrates, Plato's beloved teacher, stands as the ultimate symbol of democracy's potential for self-destruction, providing the personal motivation that drives much of Plato's political philosophy. Imagine yourself as one of Plato's students, gathering in the academy as the master begins to unfold his tale of the lost civilization. The setting he chooses for this narrative is deliberately significant. Not a lecture hall or formal symposium, but a casual conversation between Socrates and several prominent Athenians, including Plato's own great-grandfather, Critias. This framing device allows Plato to present his most radical political ideas through the comfortable medium of storytelling, making potentially dangerous criticisms of contemporary society seem like ancient history rather than direct attacks on current institutions. The story begins, as Plato tells it, with Critias recounting a tale passed down through his family from the legendary lawgiver Solon, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels. This elaborate chain of transmission serves multiple purposes in Plato's narrative strategy. By attributing the story to ancient Egyptian sources, Plato lends it the authority of antiquity while simultaneously distancing himself from its more controversial elements. If Athenian readers object to the tale's implications about democracy and empire, Plato can claim he is merely repeating foreign wisdom rather than advocating seditious ideas. The Atlantis that emerges from Plato's description represents a masterpiece of political allegory disguised as historical narrative. Every detail of the lost civilization corresponds to elements of contemporary Athenian society, but exaggerated to proportions that make their implications unmistakable. Atlantis begins as an ideal state, blessed with natural resources, wise rulers, and just laws, much as Athens once saw itself in the early days of its democracy and empire. The Atlanteans' mastery of navigation and their extensive trade networks mirror Athens' own maritime supremacy, while their democratic institutions echo the political systems that Plato's contemporaries consider the height of human achievement. Physical description of Atlantis itself carries profound symbolic meaning that extends far beyond mere geographical detail. The concentric circles of land and water that define the island's layout represent the perfect order that characterizes an ideal state, with each ring serving its proper function in harmony with the whole. The central temple dedicated to Poseidon symbolizes the divine foundation necessary for any legitimate government, while the elaborate system of canals and harbors represents the complex infrastructure required to maintain a sophisticated civilization. The constitution of Atlantis, as Plato describes it, begins with principles that any Greek reader would recognize as admirable: a balance between different social classes, respect for law and tradition, and rulers chosen for their wisdom rather than their wealth or popularity. The 10 kings who govern the island confederacy meet regularly to coordinate their policies and settle disputes through reasoned discussion rather than force. Their ceremonies include rituals designed to remind them of their responsibilities to both gods and citizens, creating a system of government that initially appears both powerful and accountable. However, Plato's true purpose becomes clear as he traces the inevitable corruption that destroys this ideal state. The Atlanteans' prosperity gradually corrupts their character, transforming virtuous citizens into luxury-seeking materialists who lose sight of the higher purposes that once motivated their society. Their rulers begin to use their power for personal gain rather than public service, while their citizens become more concerned with comfort and entertainment than with the civic duties essential to democratic government. The military prowess that once protected their freedom becomes an instrument of aggression against their neighbors. As the corrupted Atlanteans seek to expand their empire through conquest rather than trade, the parallels to contemporary Athens become unmistakable as Plato describes Atlantis' final phase of development. Like Athens, the island civilization becomes intoxicated with its own power, launching increasingly ambitious military campaigns against distant lands. The democratic institutions that once ensured wise governance become tools for demagogues who manipulate popular opinion to advance their own interests. The citizens who once took pride in their ancestors' achievements become complacent and self-indulgent, assuming that their prosperity and freedom are permanent gifts rather than fragile accomplishments that require constant vigilance to maintain. The role of divine judgment in Atlantis' destruction serves as more than mere mythological decoration in Plato's narrative. The gods' decision to punish the corrupted civilization represents the philosopher's belief that moral and political order ultimately rest on transcendent principles that human societies ignore at their peril. When the Atlanteans abandon virtue in favor of material gain and military conquest, they violate the cosmic order that sustains all legitimate government, making their destruction not just inevitable, but necessary for the restoration of universal justice. Yet Plato's account of Atlantis contains subtleties that prevent it from being dismissed as simple moralizing about the dangers of corruption. The philosopher's description of the lost civilization includes genuine admiration for its achievements, particularly in the early periods when virtue and wisdom guide its development. The technology and artistic accomplishments of the Atlanteans represent real human potentials that Plato believes could be realized under proper conditions, suggesting that his critique targets not human ambition itself, but the misdirection of that ambition toward unworthy goals. The incomplete nature of Plato's account, the promised dialogue Critias, breaks off in mid-sentence, leaving the story of Atlantis forever unfinished, may itself be intentional, reflecting the philosopher's belief that political wisdom cannot be reduced to simple formulas or definitive prescriptions. By leaving his readers to complete the story themselves, Plato forces them to engage actively with the philosophical questions his narrative raises, rather than passively accepting pre-packaged answers about the nature of justice and good government. Educational purpose underlying Plato's Atlantis story becomes clearer when viewed in the context of his broader philosophical project. The Republic, laws, and other political dialogues all attempt to understand what makes governments legitimate and durable, exploring the relationship between individual character and collective institutions. Atlantis serves as a case study in political failure, demonstrating how even the most promising societies can destroy themselves through moral corruption and the abandonment of philosophical wisdom. The story of Atlantis begins, according to Plato's carefully constructed narrative, not in the philosopher's imagination, but in the sacred archives of Egyptian temples, where priests claiming descent from ancient dynasties preserve memories reaching back to the dawn of recorded history. This attribution to Egyptian sources represents more than mere literary device. It reflects Plato's genuine respect for Egyptian civilization and his belief that the oldest cultures possess wisdom that younger societies ignore at their peril. The choice to ground his Atlantis story in Egyptian authority reveals important aspects of how ancient Greeks understood their place in the broader Mediterranean world. Egypt in Plato's time represents the ultimate example of civilizational permanence and continuity. While Greek city-states rise and fall with bewildering frequency, Egypt has maintained recognizable cultural and political institutions for thousands of years, surviving conquest, internal rebellion, and natural disasters that would destroy younger civilizations. Egyptian priests can trace their lineages and institutional memories back through dynasties that ruled when Greece was still a collection of tribal communities, making them the natural repositories of ancient wisdom about statecraft, law, and the proper relationship between human society and divine order. The specific Egyptian priest who supposedly shares the Atlantis story with Solon embodies this tradition of preserved wisdom. Plato describes him as elderly, even by the standards of a culture that reveres age. A man whose knowledge encompasses not just Egyptian history, but the rise and fall of civilizations throughout the ancient world. This priest views Greek culture with the condescending affection of an elder, observing the enthusiastic but naive efforts of children, remarking that the Greeks are essentially young as a people, lacking the institutional memory necessary to understand the great patterns of historical development. The temple archives from which the priest draws his knowledge represent a form of historical consciousness entirely foreign to Greek experience. Where Greek tradition relies primarily on oral poetry and individual memory, Egyptian record-keeping systems preserve detailed accounts of events spanning millennia. These archives, maintained by successive generations of scribes and priests, contain not just chronicles of Egyptian rulers, but observations about foreign peoples, natural disasters, and the long-term patterns that govern human affairs. The priest's ability to locate specific information about events occurring thousands of years earlier demonstrates the sophisticated nature of Egyptian historical preservation. The account of ancient Athens that the priest shares with Solon reveals how Egyptian observers understood Greek civilization in its earliest phases. According to this version of prehistory, the Athenians of 9,000 years past possessed virtues and capabilities that their descendants have largely forgotten. These ancient Athenians supposedly governed themselves according to principles of justice and wisdom that made them capable of defending not just their own freedom, but that of their neighbors against foreign aggression. The implied comparison with contemporary Athens, torn by civil war and struggling to recover from military defeat, creates a sense of decline that Plato uses to support his arguments about political degeneration. The Egyptian perspective on Atlantis itself reflects a worldview that encompasses vast temporal scales and recurring historical patterns. From the priest's vantage point, the rise and fall of the Atlantic civilization represents just one example of a universal tendency for human societies to grow powerful, become corrupted by success, and ultimately destroy themselves through hubris and aggression. This cyclical view of history contrasts sharply with Greek assumptions about progress and cultural development, suggesting that wisdom lies not in innovation, but in understanding and avoiding the patterns that lead to civilizational collapse. Natural disasters that punctuate the priest's historical narrative serve as more than mere background detail. They represent the cosmic forces that periodically cleanse the world of accumulated corruption and provide opportunities for fresh starts in human development. The great flood that destroyed much of early Greek civilization, the earthquakes that swallowed Atlantis, and the various catastrophes that have reshaped the Mediterranean world all reflect divine intervention in human affairs, punishing societies that violate natural law and clearing the way for new experiments in governance and culture. The priest's criticism of the Greek historical consciousness reveals important differences between Egyptian and Hellenic approaches to preserving cultural memory. Where Greeks celebrate individual heroes and dramatic events, Egyptian tradition focuses on institutional continuity and the slow accumulation of wisdom through generations of experience. This difference in perspective allows the Egyptian priest to recognize patterns that escape Greek observers, who become too caught up in immediate circumstances to understand their place in larger historical developments. The technical details that the priest provides about ancient Athens and Atlantis demonstrate the sophisticated nature of Egyptian geographic and ethnographic knowledge. His descriptions of climate conditions, agricultural systems, and military organization in the distant past reflect centuries of systematic observation and record-keeping. This accumulated knowledge allows Egyptian scholars to understand relationships between environmental factors and political development that remain invisible to cultures lacking similar institutional memory. The religious framework underlying the priest's historical narrative reflects Egyptian beliefs about divine justice and the moral order of the universe. From this perspective, the destruction of Atlantis represents not arbitrary catastrophe, but the necessary restoration of cosmic balance after human arrogance and aggression threaten universal harmony. The gods who punish the Atlanteans act not from petty anger, but from their responsibility to maintain the eternal principles that govern both natural and human affairs. The transmission of this ancient wisdom through Egyptian institutional channels raises important questions about the relationship between written and oral tradition in preserving historical knowledge. While the priest draws his information from written archives, the process by which this knowledge reaches Solon and eventually Plato involves multiple stages of oral communication, each potentially altering the original account in subtle but significant ways. This layered transmission process may reflect Plato's understanding that philosophical truth cannot be captured completely in written form, but requires active interpretation and application by each generation. The authority that Plato grants to Egyptian sources in his Atlantis narrative reflects broader Greek attitudes toward ancient wisdom and cultural development. Despite their pride in Greek achievements in philosophy, politics, and the arts, many Greek intellectuals recognized that their civilization had much to learn from older cultures with deeper historical experience. The attribution of the Atlantis story to Egyptian sources allows Plato to present potentially controversial ideas about politics and social organization under the protection of ancient authority, making his critique of contemporary Greek society seem like foreign wisdom rather than domestic sedition. The specific choice of Egypt as the source for Atlantis knowledge also serves Plato's philosophical purposes by grounding his narrative in a culture associated with mathematical precision, astronomical observation, and systematic thinking about natural law. Egyptian achievements in engineering, medicine, and administrative organization provided concrete evidence that human reason could create lasting institutions and solve complex practical problems. This connection between Egyptian wisdom and successful governance strengthens Plato's argument that philosophical understanding should guide political decision-making. The dialogue known as the Critias breaks off abruptly in the middle of a sentence, leaving Plato's detailed description of Atlantis forever incomplete and creating one of classical literature's most tantalizing mysteries. This unfinished state cannot be attributed to accident or the simple pressures of an aging philosopher's schedule. The incomplete nature of the Atlantis narrative reflects deliberate artistic and philosophical choices that reveal important aspects of Plato's educational methods and his understanding of how wisdom is transmitted from teacher to student. Consider the dramatic moment at which Plato chooses to end his narrative. The dialogue breaks off just as Critias begins to describe the final corruption of Atlantean society and the divine decision to punish their crimes through natural disaster. Readers are left suspended at the precise moment when the philosophical implications of the story would become most explicit, forcing them to complete the narrative themselves through reflection and discussion rather than passive absorption of predetermined conclusions. This technique exemplifies Plato's conviction that true learning occurs not through the transmission of information, but through the active engagement of the student's mind with fundamental questions about justice, power, and human nature. Incomplete Critias also reflects the broader structure of Plato's philosophical project, which consistently uses dialogue and narrative incompleteness to stimulate rather than satisfy intellectual curiosity. Throughout his corpus, Plato employs similar techniques: conversations that end in aporia or confusion, questions that receive multiple contradictory answers, narratives that require readers to supply missing elements. This approach grows from his belief that wisdom cannot be packaged as a finished product and delivered to passive recipients, but must be actively discovered through the collaborative process of inquiry and reflection. The practical circumstances surrounding the composition of the Critias provide additional insight into why Plato might have left the dialogue unfinished. The work was written during the later period of his career, when the philosopher was increasingly focused on the practical problems of governing the academy and developing educational curricula for future leaders. The time and energy required to complete such an elaborate narrative might have seemed less important than more direct forms of philosophical and political engagement, particularly as Plato became involved in the complicated politics of Syracuse and other Greek cities seeking his advice on constitutional reform. The literary artistry of the unfinished dialogue demonstrates Plato's sophisticated understanding of how narrative structure affects reader response. By ending the story at the moment of greatest dramatic tension, he ensures that the Atlantis tale will remain vivid in readers' memories, continuing to provoke questions and generate discussion long after the immediate reading experience ends. Complete narratives, no matter how skillfully crafted, tend to fade from memory once their conclusions provide closure. Unfinished stories maintain their psychological presence through the mind's natural tendency to seek completion and resolution. The philosophical implications of the dialogue's incomplete state extend beyond mere literary technique to fundamental questions about the nature of political wisdom and historical understanding. By refusing to provide a complete account of Atlantis' destruction, Plato implicitly argues that the most important lessons about political development cannot be reduced to simple formulas or definitive historical examples. Each society must discover for itself the specific applications of universal principles about justice and governance, making the completion of the Atlantis story less important than the general framework it provides for understanding political success and failure. The educational context in which Plato's dialogues were originally used suggests another reason for the Critias' incomplete state. These works were not intended primarily as literature for individual readers, but as materials for group discussion and analysis within the academy and similar educational institutions. An unfinished dialogue provides far richer opportunities for classroom exploration than a completed narrative, allowing students to debate alternative endings, examine different interpretations of the established elements, and apply the story's framework to contemporary political situations. The relationship between the Critias and Plato's other political writings reveals how the unfinished Atlantis narrative fits into his broader philosophical program. The Republic provides a theoretical framework for understanding ideal government, while the Laws offers detailed prescriptions for practical constitutional design. The Atlantis story occupies a middle ground between these approaches, offering concrete historical illustration of abstract principles without constraining readers with overly specific recommendations. The dialogue's incomplete state preserves this balance, preventing the narrative from becoming either too theoretical or too prescriptive. The transmission history of events in Plato's text suggests that ancient readers may have understood the Critias' incomplete state differently than modern audiences do. In a culture where written texts serve primarily as memory aids for oral instruction, the unfinished dialogue would have provided a starting point for teachers to develop their own versions of the story's conclusion based on their understanding of Platonic principles and the specific needs of their students. This approach treats the written text as a flexible tool rather than a fixed authority, encouraging creative engagement rather than passive acceptance. The psychological effect of encountering an unfinished narrative creates a unique form of intellectual engagement that serves Plato's educational purposes better than completion might have done. Readers who expect closure and resolution find themselves forced to become active participants in the storytelling process, supplying from their own imagination and reasoning the elements that the author has deliberately withheld. This shift from passive consumption to active creation mirrors the broader Platonic goal of transforming students from receptacles for received wisdom into independent thinkers, capable of philosophical reflection. The thematic appropriateness of leaving the Atlantis story unfinished becomes clear when considered in relation to Plato's broader views about human knowledge and the limits of certainty. Just as the Socratic method consistently reveals the inadequacy of conventional opinions and the difficulty of achieving certain knowledge, the incomplete Critias reminds readers that even the most elaborate historical narratives cannot provide simple answers to complex questions about political development and social organization. The unfinished state of the dialogue thus becomes a form of intellectual humility, acknowledging the provisional nature of all human attempts to understand the patterns governing historical change. The artistic parallel between the dialogue's incomplete state and the destruction it describes creates a subtle but powerful metaphor for the fragility of all human achievements. Just as Atlantean civilization vanishes before its story can be completed, the Critias itself remains forever, suspended at the moment of anticipated catastrophe. This formal parallel reinforces the dialogue's thematic concerns about the impermanence of political institutions and the constant vigilance required to maintain civilized society against the forces of corruption and decay. Modern attempts to complete or continue Plato's Atlantis narrative, while understandable as expressions of literary curiosity, fundamentally misunderstand the philosophical purposes that the story's incomplete state serves. By providing closure that Plato deliberately withheld, such efforts transform the dialogue from an instrument of philosophical education into mere entertainment, defeating the very purposes for which it was originally created. The true completion of the Critias occurs not through additional narrative, but through the reader's own philosophical reflection on the questions it raises about justice, power, and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. In the highest circles of Atlantean society, where marble corridors echo with the soft footfalls of servants and the distant sound of fountains playing in courtyards designed to capture every cooling breeze, the reality of power reveals itself in ways both magnificent and profoundly corrupt. Imagine yourself as a visitor to the great palace complex that crowns the central island of Atlantis, where the ruling council maintains its elaborate court and the wealthiest families display their influence through increasingly extravagant demonstrations of luxury and refinement. Here, in chambers decorated with precious metals extracted from the earth's depths and walls adorned with murals depicting the empire's greatest victories, the final act of Atlantean civilization plays out with all the tragic inevitability of a carefully choreographed dance toward destruction. The palace itself represents the pinnacle of Atlantean architectural achievement, a structure that grows organically from the living rock of the island's core through generations of expansion and renovation. Each successive ruler has added new wings, towers, and decorative elements, creating a complex that sprawls across terraced levels connected by covered walkways and suspended bridges. The building materials alone demonstrate the global reach of Atlantean power. Marble quarried from distant mountains, cedar beams harvested from forests that exist only in the empire's furthest territories, precious stones gathered from lands whose names are whispered in the palace but unknown to common citizens. The daily routines of palace life reflect a society that has lost all connection to the practical concerns that once drove Atlantean expansion and innovation. The morning begins not with councils of war or meetings about trade policy, but with elaborate ceremonies designed to celebrate the ruler's supposed divine nature and their hereditary right to command lesser mortals. These rituals, performed in chambers where every surface gleams with polished metal and inlaid gems, require armies of servants whose only function is to maintain the illusion that their masters exist on a plane of reality separate from ordinary. Human experience. Palace nobles wake each day to find their needs anticipated and satisfied without effort on their part. Meals prepared by master chefs who compete to create ever more exotic delicacies. Clothing selected by specialists who understand the subtle messages conveyed by different fabrics and colors. Entertainment provided by artists whose talents are devoted entirely to amusing an audience that no longer remembers what genuine beauty or wisdom might look like. This complete separation from practical responsibility creates a class of rulers who possess absolute power over their empire, while remaining utterly ignorant of the forces that make their dominance possible. The political structure that governs late-period Atlantis reflects this disconnection between authority and understanding. The council chambers, where major decisions are supposedly made, have become theaters for elaborate debates about protocol, precedence, and the proper interpretation of ancient ceremonial traditions. Real power flows through informal networks of personal loyalty and financial obligation, creating a system where influence depends more on one's ability to provide luxury and entertainment than on wisdom, experience, or genuine concern for the empire's welfare. The corruption that permeates palace society extends far beyond simple greed or personal indulgence to encompass a fundamental transformation in how the Atlantean elite understands their relationship to both their subjects and the natural world, where their ancestors saw themselves as stewards responsible for maintaining the prosperity and security of their civilization. The final generation of Atlantean rulers views their empire as an inexhaustible source of wealth and pleasure designed solely for their personal enjoyment. This shift in perspective makes them incapable of recognizing the warning signs that might alert more responsible leaders to approaching catastrophe. The palace's relationship with the military reflects this broader transformation of Atlantean values and priorities. The warrior traditions that once made Atlantean armies formidable instruments of defense and expansion have degenerated into ceremonial displays designed primarily to impress foreign visitors and reinforce the ruling class's sense of their own importance. Elite military units spend more time practicing elaborate parade formations and developing combat skills, while the weapons and armor they display in palace ceremonies prioritize decorative value over practical effectiveness. Economic decisions made within the palace walls reveal the elite's complete detachment from the realities that sustain their empire. Trade policies are crafted not to promote prosperity or maintain relationships with foreign partners, but to maximize the flow of luxury goods into the palace storerooms and treasure chambers. Agricultural regulations ignore the need to maintain soil fertility and prevent erosion, focusing instead on extracting maximum short-term profits from lands that previous generations had carefully preserved. Mining operations strip mountainsides and drain underground resources with no consideration for long-term consequences, driven entirely by the palace's insatiable demand for precious metals and gemstones. The educational systems that produce new generations of Atlantean leaders reflect and perpetuate these corrupted values. Young nobles receive extensive training in art appreciation, musical performance, and the intricate social protocols that govern palace life. But they learn nothing about engineering, agriculture, or the practical skills necessary to maintain a complex civilization. Their teachers, themselves products of this same system, cannot transmit knowledge they never acquired, creating a cycle of ignorance that grows more pronounced with each passing generation. The palace's approach to religion and philosophy demonstrates how intellectual corruption accompanies moral decay in the final phase of Atlantean development. The spiritual traditions that once provided ethical guidance and encouraged rulers to consider their responsibilities to both gods and subjects have been transformed into elaborate justifications for absolute power and unlimited self-indulgence. Priests and philosophers compete to develop increasingly sophisticated arguments proving that the elite's desires align perfectly with divine will, creating theological systems that sanctify greed and celebrate the very vices that traditional wisdom condemned. The architectural evolution of the palace complex itself tells the story of Atlantean decline in stone and metal. Early sections, built when the empire was expanding and rulers still understood the need for defensive strength, feature solid construction and practical design elements that could serve military purposes if necessary. Later editions prioritize appearance over function, creating magnificent spaces that impress visitors, but serve no useful purpose beyond displaying wealth. The most recent construction projects focus entirely on personal comfort and entertainment, including elaborate bath complexes, private theaters, and dining halls designed for banquets that can last for days. Family relationships within the palace reveal how personal corruption mirrors and reinforces the broader institutional decay affecting Atlantean society. Marriage among the elite has become purely a matter of political and economic calculation, with romantic considerations entirely subordinated to questions of alliance and inheritance. Children grow up surrounded by servants who cater to their every whim, never learning self-discipline or developing genuine affection for anything beyond their own immediate gratification. Parent-child relationships focus on transferring wealth and status rather than wisdom or moral guidance, creating dynasties that become weaker and more corrupt with each succeeding generation. The palace's interaction with the broader Atlantean population demonstrates the growing isolation of the ruling class from the people they supposedly govern. Complex protocols prevent common citizens from approaching their rulers directly, while the elaborate bureaucracy that manages these interactions focuses more on maintaining proper forms than on addressing real problems or concerns. Palace nobles venture into the city only for carefully orchestrated events designed to reinforce their authority and display their magnificence, never engaging in the kind of informal contact that might help them understand their subjects' actual needs or concerns. The international relations conducted from the palace reflect the same combination of arrogance and ignorance that characterizes domestic policy. Atlantean diplomats, trained to expect automatic deference from foreign representatives, prove increasingly incapable of negotiating genuine agreements or maintaining the complex relationships that sustain their empire's commercial networks. Military expeditions launched from the palace pursue goals that make sense only within the artificial world of elite competition, ignoring strategic realities that previous generations of leaders would have understood instinctively. Deep within the palace complex, accessible only through passages known to the highest initiates of Atlantean society, lie the legendary crystal chambers where the Empire's most closely guarded secrets are both preserved and perverted. These spaces, carved from the living rock of the island's core and lined with crystalline formations that pulse with their own inner light, represent the ultimate expression of Atlantean technological and mystical achievement. Yet, like everything else in the final phase of their civilization, these marvels have been corrupted from instruments of wisdom and beneficial power into tools of oppression and self-aggrandizement. The crystals themselves embody the dangerous seduction of power divorced from wisdom. These massive formations, some reaching from floor to ceiling in chambers that dwarf even the palace's grandest reception halls, were originally discovered by Atlantean miners following veins of precious metal deep into the island's volcanic core. Early researchers quickly realized that these crystals possessed properties unlike anything found elsewhere in the known world. They could store and focus various forms of energy, amplify human mental capabilities, and interact with the Earth's natural forces in ways that seemed to border on the miraculous. The first generations of Atlantean crystal workers approached these discoveries with appropriate caution and reverence, understanding that they were dealing with forces that could easily overwhelm human comprehension and control. They developed elaborate rules and safety procedures designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic accidents that could result from careless manipulation of such powerful tools. The crystal chambers were originally designed as research facilities and meditation spaces where carefully selected individuals could gradually learn to work with these forces while remaining grounded in ethical principles and practical wisdom. However, as Atlantean society grew more prosperous and its rulers more isolated from ordinary human concerns, the crystal chambers gradually transformed from centers of learning into instruments of political control and personal aggrandizement. The elaborate safety procedures developed by earlier generations were simplified or abandoned entirely as palace nobles grew impatient with restrictions that limited their access to power. The careful selection process that once ensured only the most qualified individuals could work with the crystals gave way to systems based on political loyalty and personal connections rather than competence or wisdom. The corrupted crystal practices of late period Atlantis reveal themselves most clearly in the ways these powerful tools are used to maintain the elite's dominance over their subjects. Crystals that once facilitated communication across vast distances now serve primarily to spy on potential rivals and suppress dissent within the empire. Formations that could enhance agricultural productivity or improve weather patterns are instead employed to create artificial scarcity that increases the value of goods controlled by palace merchants. The healing properties that early researchers discovered in certain crystal configurations become tools for extending the lives of aging nobles while denying similar benefits to common citizens. The psychological effects of prolonged crystal exposure, initially documented by careful observers who noted both benefits and dangers associated with these practices, are now completely ignored by practitioners who have convinced themselves that their superior nature makes them immune to harmful consequences. The enhanced mental clarity that crystals can provide when used properly becomes a form of artificial intelligence that substitutes for genuine wisdom, allowing users to process information more quickly while losing the capacity for ethical reflection and emotional empathy that characterizes authentic human understanding. That the chamber hierarchy reflects the broader social stratification that characterizes corrupted Atlantean society. The largest and most powerful crystals are reserved for the handful of individuals who occupy the highest positions in the palace hierarchy, while lesser nobles must content themselves with smaller formations that provide limited access to the forces their superiors can command at will. This artificial scarcity creates intense competition among the elite, encouraging the kind of scheming and backstabbing that undermines effective governance while ensuring that crystal knowledge remains fragmented and incomplete. The architectural design of the crystal chambers themselves demonstrates how aesthetic beauty can mask functional corruption. These spaces are undeniably magnificent, with crystalline walls that refract light into spectacular displays of color and pattern. The acoustic properties of the chambers create an otherworldly atmosphere that makes even ordinary speech sound profound and mystical. Yet this beauty serves primarily to distract visitors from recognizing the essential emptiness of the activities conducted within these spaces. Elaborate ceremonies that produce impressive sensory effects while accomplishing nothing of genuine value. The technical knowledge required to maintain and operate the crystal systems has become increasingly centralized and secretive, creating dangerous dependencies that make the entire system vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Where earlier generations maintained detailed written records and trained multiple individuals in each crucial skill, the final phase of Atlantean crystal work relies on small groups of specialists who guard their knowledge jealously and refuse to share it with potential rivals. This hoarding of expertise means that the loss of even a few key individuals could cripple systems that the entire Palace complex depends upon for basic functions. The interaction between crystal technology and the island's natural geology creates risks that the current practitioners neither understand nor acknowledge. The massive energy flows channeled through the crystal chambers generate heat and electromagnetic effects that gradually destabilize the volcanic systems underlying Atlantis. What began as subtle changes in underground temperature and pressure patterns has accelerated into dangerous instabilities that threaten the island's geological foundations. Yet the crystal workers, intoxicated by their sense of power and superiority, dismiss warnings from more traditional Earth readers as primitive superstition unworthy of their advanced understanding. The military applications of crystal technology reveal perhaps most clearly how noble purposes can be perverted through moral corruption. Defensive systems originally designed to protect Atlantis from foreign invasion are increasingly turned against the Empire's own subjects, creating networks of surveillance and control that make effective resistance to tyrannical policies virtually impossible. Weapons that could defend against external threats become instruments of aggression used to intimidate neighbors and extract tribute from weaker societies, transforming Atlantis from a stabilizing regional power into a source of chaos and oppression. The religious and philosophical justifications developed to support these corrupted crystal practices demonstrate the intellectual dishonesty that accompanies moral decay in any sophisticated society. Complex theological arguments purport to prove that the elite's monopolization of crystal power serves divine purposes and benefits all humanity, while elaborate philosophical systems rationalize the increasing concentration of wealth and authority in fewer and fewer hands. These intellectual frameworks, however sophisticated they may appear, serve primarily to help the crystal workers avoid confronting the obvious contradictions between their actions and the ethical principles of their civilization. Once endorsed, the grandest dining hall in the Palace of Atlantis hosts what will prove to be the final gathering of the Empire's elite, though none of the magnificently dressed participants could imagine that their glittering assembly represents the last celebration of a civilization already racing toward its doom. The evening begins with all the elaborate ceremony that has come to characterize Atlantean court life. Servants moving with practiced precision through choreographed routines designed to demonstrate their master's wealth and refinement. Musicians filling the vast space with harmonies that mask the underlying tensions threatening to tear their society apart. And guests competing to display their sophistication through increasingly extravagant demonstrations of luxury and cultural knowledge. The menu itself tells the story of an empire that has extended its reach across the known world, bringing together delicacies from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. Egyptian lotus blossoms float in crystal bowls beside British amber honey, while Phoenician purple-dyed dates complement wine aged in caves carved from the volcanic slopes of distant islands. Each course requires ingredients that can only be obtained through the complex trade networks that have made Atlantean prosperity possible. Yet the diners consume these rarities without any understanding of the political and economic relationships that deliver such abundance to their tables. The conversation that flows around the banquet tables reveals the profound disconnection between Atlantean elites and the realities of their empire situation. Guests debate the relative merits of different artistic styles, discuss the genealogies of their various bloodlines, and engage in elaborate verbal competitions designed to demonstrate their wit and cultural refinement. What they do not discuss, because they no longer possess the knowledge or inclination to address such mundane matters, are the reports filtering back from the Empire's periphery about increasing unrest, economic instability, and the growing boldness of enemies who once feared Atlantean power. The entertainment provided for this final gathering demonstrates both the heights of Atlantean artistic achievement and the ultimate corruption of creative energy when it serves only to amuse. an audience incapable of genuine appreciation. Dancers perform elaborate routines that require years of training to master. Yet their movements tell stories that celebrate conquest and domination rather than beauty or truth. Musicians play compositions of stunning technical complexity, but their melodies lack the emotional depth that once made Atlantean culture genuinely moving rather than merely impressive. The guest list for this ultimate celebration reads like a catalog of everything that has gone wrong with Atlantean society. Military commanders who have never seen actual combat mix with merchants who have never personally negotiated a trade agreement. Priests who understand ritual but have lost all connection to genuine spirituality share tables with philosophers whose elaborate theories bear no relationship to practical wisdom or ethical behavior. The ruling council members present include individuals whose primary qualification for power is their skill at palace intrigue rather than any demonstrated ability to govern effectively. The palace setting for this final banquet showcases the architectural achievements that will soon lie buried beneath volcanic ash and seawater. The dining hall itself spans dimensions that dwarf similar spaces in other civilizations, with a ceiling supported by columns carved from single blocks of marble and decorated with precious metals that gleam in the light of 1,000 oil lamps. The walls display frescoes depicting the great moments of Atlantean history, though these artistic narratives focus on military victories and displays of wealth rather than the innovations in agriculture, engineering, and social organization that actually built their civilization. The servants who facilitate this evening of luxury represent one of the most troubling aspects of late-period Atlantean society, the creation of a permanent underclass whose existence allows the elite to remain completely divorced from practical reality. These individuals, many of them foreigners, captured during military campaigns or purchased from slave markets throughout the Mediterranean, possess skills and knowledge that their masters no longer value or understand. The irony that the empire's survival depends increasingly on the competence of people who have no stake in its continued existence entirely escapes the attention of those who consider themselves its natural rulers. The timing of this banquet, though the participants remain blissfully unaware of its significance, coincides with the final stages of the geological processes that will destroy their island paradise. Deep beneath the palace foundations, the massive magma chamber that has been slowly filling and heating for decades approaches the critical pressure that will trigger catastrophic eruption. The crystal chamber's continued operations have destabilized natural systems that might otherwise have vented this pressure gradually and safely, creating conditions that make violent release inevitable. Yet the surface symptoms of approaching disaster, increased tremor frequency, changes in spring temperature, unusual animal behavior, remain invisible to palace dwellers who have insulated themselves so completely from their environment that they no longer notice. Its warnings, the political discussions that occur between courses, reveal the complete bankruptcy of Atlantean leadership at this crucial moment in their civilization's history. Factional disputes focus on questions of ceremonial precedence and the distribution of luxury goods rather than the strategic challenges facing their empire. Military planning, to the extent it occurs at all, assumes that Atlantean technological superiority will continue to guarantee victory regardless of the competence or motivation of their enemies. Economic policy remains focused on maximizing short-term extraction of wealth from subject territories without consideration for the long-term sustainability of these arrangements. The religious ceremonies that punctuate the evening's festivities demonstrate how completely the Atlantean elite have perverted the spiritual traditions that once provided ethical guidance for their civilization. Prayers offer thanks not for wisdom, justice, or the well-being of their subjects, but for continued prosperity and the maintenance of their privileged position. Ritual offerings to the gods consist of valuable objects that symbolize wealth, rather than sacrifices that might represent genuine commitment to higher principles. The priests who conduct these ceremonies have become indistinguishable from court entertainers, performing elaborate rites designed to impress their audience rather than facilitate authentic communication with divine forces. The philosophical discussions that emerge as the evening progresses reveal the intellectual corruption that accompanies moral decay in any sophisticated society. Complex arguments purport to prove that the current arrangement of power and privilege represents the natural order of the universe, while elaborate theories justify the exploitation of weaker peoples as beneficial to all concerned. These intellectual frameworks, however sophisticated they may appear, serve primarily to help the elite avoid confronting the obvious contradictions between their behavior and the ethical principles their ancestors once took seriously. The entertainment reaches its climax with performances that celebrate Atlantean dominance over both natural forces and foreign peoples. Elaborate pageants reenact military victories, using captive soldiers forced to play the roles of their own defeated armies, while displays of crystal-powered technology demonstrate the elite's supposed mastery over the Earth's hidden powers. These demonstrations of strength and superiority serve to reassure an audience that has begun to sense, despite their best efforts to ignore such uncomfortable thoughts, that their empire's foundations have grown dangerously unstable. As the evening draws toward its close, the banquet hall fills with the kind of artificial gaiety that emerges when people instinctively understand that they are celebrating something that will soon end, even if they cannot articulate the source of their unease. Laughter becomes more forced, conversations more frantic, and displays of wealth more desperate, as if the participants hope that sufficient magnificence might somehow ward off the approaching catastrophe that their rational minds refuse to acknowledge. The final toasts of the evening celebrate the eternal nature of Atlantean civilization and the inevitable expansion of their empire to encompass the entire world, words that will prove tragically ironic when the speakers and their entire society vanish beneath the waves before another dawn breaks over their island paradise. As we reach the end of our journey through the imagined world of Atlantis and the very real catastrophe that may have inspired its legend, we find ourselves contemplating the fragile nature of all human achievement and the eternal struggle between wisdom and hubris that defines our species' relationship with the forces that govern our existence. Whether Atlantis existed as Plato described it, or whether the island of Thera provided the historical foundation for an enduring myth, the story remains compelling because it speaks to truths about power, corruption, and the price of forgetting. Our place in the natural order, the daily struggles of ordinary Atlanteans, the potters who learned to work with volcanic clay, the farmers who adapted to unstable soil, the merchants who navigated treacherous waters, remind us that survival in any era requires humility before forces greater than ourselves. Their hard-won wisdom, accumulated through generations of living with uncertainty and danger, contrasts sharply with the arrogant blindness of their rulers, who mistook temporary prosperity for permanent security and forgot that even the mightiest civilizations exist at the mercy of powers beyond human control. The real destruction of Thera provides a sobering reminder of how quickly the accumulated achievements of centuries can vanish beneath volcanic ash and seawater. The Minoan civilization that flourished on that island created art, technology, and social institutions that rivaled anything their contemporaries could achieve. Yet all their brilliance could not protect them when the Earth itself turned against their paradise. Their fate illustrates both the magnificent potential of human creativity and the ultimate fragility of everything we build. Plato's philosophical use of the Atlantis story transcends both historical speculation and disaster narrative to explore timeless questions about justice, governance, and the moral foundations necessary for any society's survival. His unfinished tale continues to provoke reflection precisely because it refuses to provide simple answers. forcing each generation to complete the story through their own understanding of how civilizations rise and fall, perhaps the most profound lesson emerging from our exploration of Atlantis lies not in the specific details of its imagined society or the geological forces that might have destroyed it, but in the recognition that every human community faces the same fundamental choice between wisdom and folly, between stewardship and exploitation, between humility and hubris. The comfortable distance of mythology and ancient history cannot entirely insulate us from the uncomfortable realization that our own civilization displays many of the warning signs that marked Atlantis in its final phase. Yet there is comfort to be found in understanding that these cycles of rise and decline represent not arbitrary fate, but the predictable consequences of human choices. The knowledge preserved in stories like Atlantis, whether historical or mythological, provides each generation with the opportunity to learn from past mistakes and choose different paths. In this sense, the true treasure of the lost civilization lies not in any sunken palaces or crystal chambers, but in the wisdom that can guide us toward more sustainable and just ways of organizing human society. As you settle into sleep tonight, carrying with you these images of marble streets and volcanic fire, of crystal chambers and palace banquets, remember that the greatest protection against catastrophe lies not in the power to control natural forces, but in the wisdom to live in harmony with them. The gentle rhythm of your breathing, the solid ground beneath your bed, the roof that shelters you from wind and rain. These simple blessings represent the true foundations of civilization, more precious than all the gold and gems that once filled Atlantean treasuries. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow brings new opportunities to choose wisdom over folly, stewardship over exploitation, and humility over the pride that goes before destruction.